Maimonides, Baruch Spinoza, Nachman Krochmal, Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, and Jacob Taubes. Previously, Sacks has served as the director of the Jewish Publication Society. We are happy to have you and hope that you guys enjoy.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Good to see all of you in person. Good to see those of you online. All of you in person should have a handout in front of you. Those of you online, I'm going to be, if you look at your screen, you should see the relevant text. And I want to say it's particularly exciting to be here in this building where upon moving to Denver 13 years ago, my son was in preschool for 9 months. So it's wonderful to be here and always an honor to get to learn with these communities. Okay, so our topic for this hour is great Jewish heretics. And sometimes when I kind of share this topic with people, I get some pushback on the use of the term heretics in the context of discussing Judaism. Could someone give us a definition? When you hear the word heretic, what do you take that word to mean? I'm directing these questions primarily to those in person here. Yes?
Who doesn't believe what is the normal way to believe in the place where they live is that they happen to live there.
Okay. Someone who doesn't believe the normal way to believe. Someone who believes something that they ought not to believe. I think that's a good working definition of heretic. And sometimes the pushback I get on using this term in the context of Judaism is pushback that goes something like, but come on, Judaism doesn't have heretics, right? Judaism is a religion that grants you freedom to believe what you want to believe. Maybe Judaism demands that you do some things rather than other things, but Judaism, unlike other religions, doesn't have fixed dogmas have to affirm. Judaism is a kind of tolerant, free religion in a way that maybe others aren't. There is some degree of truth to that statement, but it's a more complicated situation, I think, than that statement appears. Can I get a volunteer to read the first text on the handout? This is a text from the 5th book of the Hebrew Bible, the book of Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Thank you.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might.
Thank you. I'm guessing some of you may have heard this line before. Where have you heard this line before? Shema, central liturgical moment in Jewish prayer. Traditionally, every morning and every evening, every day of the year, this is recited, right? Centerpiece of Jewish prayer. Does this line seem comfortable with the idea that there might be two gods? Does this line seem comfortable with the idea that you might believe that God is worthy of hate, contempt, disgust, and utter mockery? So for those online, people in the room are shaking their heads. No, this text pretty emphatically says, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Presumably this line only makes sense if some people out there think that there's more than one God. And this line is emphatically saying, no, 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 that's not the right thing to believe. Presumably this line only makes sense if it assumes that someone might not want to love God. And this text is saying you have to. This line, this central moment in Jewish prayer, seems to be ruling some beliefs in and some beliefs out, at least for the author of this text. The author of this text seems to think that it's okay, maybe even necessary, to believe that God is one, and deeply problematic to believe that God is two. And this is not just an incidental feature of the Shema. We see similar claims in a variety of other Jewish texts. Can I get a volunteer to read the next passage? This is a line from a text called the Mishnah. This is one of the first kind of classics of what's called rabbinic literature, the kind of body of texts produced by an ancient network of intellectuals known as the rabbis, who really helped create the forms of Judaism we still have today. This is a text that's compiled around the year 200. Can I get a volunteer to read this passage? Thank you.
All of the Jewish people have a share in the world to come, as it is stated. And your people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. The branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. And these are the members of the Jewish people who have no share in the world to come. Someone who says that there's no doctrine of the resurrection of the dead derivable from Torah, or the Torah does not come from heaven, and an Epicurus.
Thank you so much. So first, this text uses the phrase world to come, in Hebrew, olam haba. Someone familiar with this term wants to give us a kind of working definition of what the term olam haba, world to come, means. The world after you die. It's a term that means lots of different things in lots of different texts, but I would say probably the most common usage, and probably the usage that's meant here, is whatever happens after you die. We can leave aside for the moment what that is. It's a good thing in general to be in the world to come. According to this text, do all Jews make it into whatever that afterlife is? Who doesn't make it into that afterlife? Okay, and let's even read it. Someone who says there is no doctrine of the resurrection of the dead derivable from Torah, right? So someone who says that the dead aren't going to be resurrected, or at least someone who says that I can't read the Bible and from the Bible know that people aren't resurrected. So if you believe that you can't derive resurrection from the Bible, you're excluded from the world to come. Anyone else excluded from the world to come, according to this text?
Yeah, Torah is not divine.
Okay, so if I also believe that the Torah doesn't come from God, and then there's this other category in Epicurus. It's not entirely clear what Epicurus means. It can sometimes mean someone who denies God's involvement in the world, someone who acts contemptuously towards kind of scholars of Torah. It's a term that means a variety of different things. But this text, again, seems to be really interested in drawing boundaries around belief. It doesn't say all Jews make it into the world to come, except Jews who are cruel to other people, act immorally, don't exemplify the ethical values. It doesn't even say Jews who fail to keep Shabbat or pray, right? You get denied access to the world to come here on the basis of what you believe. If you think you can't derive resurrection from the Bible, you're out. If you think the Bible doesn't come from God, you're out. Now, these texts have long and complicated histories in the Jewish tradition, and there are other voices as well, but at the very least, these texts, which by any account historically are central to the Jewish tradition, seem pretty comfortable with the idea that someone can be a heretic, that someone can believe something that you're not supposed to believe, and that there are consequences for that. And so this is really the question that I want us to think together about today. What does it mean to think about heresy in the history of the Jewish tradition? Who are some of the figures in Judaism who have been described as heretics? What did they say and think that led people to describe them as heretics? And what do we think about this today? What do we think about their ideas? What do we think about the very idea of talking about heresy? And so we'll kind of proceed in three stages. We'll begin with one figure who's been described as a heretic, a figure named Moses Maimonides, probably the best known medieval Jewish thinker, whose books are in every Jewish library. I'm sure there are many copies of his books in this building right now. For example, I have some right there, but I suspect these are not the only copies of books in this building. He was seen by many of his. Then, if we have time, we may just get stuck with Maimonides, which is fine. We'll look at another Spinoza, one of the most important philosophers in the Enlightenment, who was actually formally kicked out of his Jewish community in Amsterdam in the 17th century for being a heretic. And then we'll conclude by thinking about what this means for us today. Does this seem reasonable as an agenda? Okay, so Maimonides. Maimonides is born in 1138, probably dies in 1204. I mean, we know he dies. We're just not entirely sure if it was in 1204. He's born in Spain, ends up moving to North Africa, and spends most of his life in Egypt, where he basically does everything. He is a physician. In fact, he is a Jewish physician in the Islamic royal court in Cairo. He's a Jewish political leader, so Jewish communities across the world come to him when they find themselves in difficult political situations and need advice. He's a legal thinker. He writes the first comprehensive code of Jewish law called the Mishneh Torah, or the repetition of the Torah. So you'll had a little bit of an ego. You don't call a book the repetition of the Torah unless you think that what you're writing is a successor to the first Torah. And this is really the first comprehensive code of Jewish law ever. And he's an important philosopher. He writes a book called The Guide of the Perplexed. And he was hugely influential in his time. As I said, he's hugely influential today. And he was a subject of bitter controversy, both during his life and after his death. There were a series of what were known as the Maimonidean controversies, where people within the Jewish community debated whether it was permissible to read his books. And at one point, the pro-Maimonidean position, the position that said, yeah, this guy is okay, was one that said, well, you could read some of his works once you're middle-aged and have children and established and can be trusted to read these dangerous works. And that was the pro-Maimonidean position. So we'll try to think a little bit about why he might have seemed heretical. And to do that, we need to make a very quick detour, and I promise it will be quick, into medieval science and philosophy. So one of the main things that medieval Jewish philosophers like Maimonides did, and not just medieval Jewish philosophers, medieval Muslim philosophers as well, and eventually medieval today, with the Jewish tradition. Very similar to ways that people might try to reconcile science with religion today. The kind of science that they took to be the best science of their day in the Middle Ages was, of course, different, but the project was similar. The project was, again, saying, look, science is clearly doing something that's true. Religion is clearly doing something that's... One way they did this was by thinking about what we today would call astronomy, by thinking about the kind of observed movements of heavenly bodies like stars and planets and the sun. Today, we think of the solar system as one where the sun is at the center and planets like Earth go around it. That wasn't the dominant medieval model. I've given you on your hand, those of you online can see it on your screen, a picture of the universe for medieval scientists. This was derived from an ancient Greek philosopher named Aristotle. And the basic picture put the Earth at the center, and then imagine the cosmos as a series of concentric spheres around the Earth. And things like the sun and planets are embedded in those spheres. So when I see the sun going around the Earth, right, rising one part of the Earth, setting the other, what's happening is the sphere in which the sun is embedded is turning around. And that's why I see it when I see the planets move over time. Again, what's happened is each planet is embedded in a sphere, and that sphere is turning. And that was the kind of medieval scientific explanation of how the cosmos worked, and why, when I look up at the heavens, I see regular motions of stars, planets, and the sun, right? Each of them is embedded in one of these spheres. Is this sort of making sense so far? Okay. By the way, you've now exhausted all of my scientific knowledge, either medieval or modern. And what medieval philosophers said, like Maimonides, or let's say medieval Jewish and Muslim philosophers said, and then we're going to read a text in a second, was, great, I can actually accomplish a lot religiously with these ideas. So first, if I look at the heavens, what I see is not irregular motion. I don't see that on some days the sun rises and on some days the sun sets. I see that this happens again and again over time. And if I track records going back thousands of years, I also see that there's regular motion of the sun. The sun seems to be moving regularly. Same with planets and other heavenly bodies. They don't seem to vary. There seems to be kind of regular motion. Each sphere seems to be turning eternally. Well, if each sphere is turning eternally, there must be some cause of that motion. Things don't move without some cause. So there must be some ultimate cause of all of this regular motion. We're going to call that God, right? The ultimate cause of everything in the cosmos. So first, medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophers said, if I think hard enough about astronomy, I can derive that there is a God. And moreover, I can even know some stuff about that God. For example, I can know that that God doesn't have a body. Because again, these things are moving eternally. They're not slowing down. They're not changing pace. They're not getting weaker over time. But you know what? That's what bodies do. Bodies don't turn things eternally. Bodies decay, bodies get sick, bodies get weaker, bodies eventually die. If the motion in the heavens is eternal, if the sun is always going around the earth and the planets are always going around the earth, then the thing that's ultimately moving itself has to be eternally strong, and then it can't have a body, because nothing that has a body is eternally strong. So not only can I conclude that God exists, I can conclude that God doesn't have a body. This seeming reasonable so far? Okay, this is all we need to know to begin to figure out why Maimonides was seen as a heretic. Can I get a volunteer to read the next passage on the handout? This is from the very beginning of Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, right? So he writes this massive code of Jewish law called the Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, and he's got to begin somewhere. So he begins with a chapter called Hilchot Yesodei Torah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah, and this is the very first law he outlines, the very first commandment, the most important commandment he thinks that every Jew needs to follow to be a good Jew. It's at the bottom of the first page in your handout. It's on the screen for those of you online. Can I get a volunteer to read that passage where it says, the very foundation and firm support? Thank you.
The very foundation and firm support of all wisdom is to know that there is a primary reality which caused all to be. God guides the spheres, and with might, which is complete, which it could not do without cause. The Blessed One turns it although he has no body or hand. To understand, this is a positive commandment which states, I am the Lord thy God. If the Creator had a body and form, he would have an end. It is impossible to imagine a body that does not end and whose strength does not wane. Our God, blessed be he, has a strength to which there is no end and does not falter because the spirit continues to revolve forever by his force, which is not a bodily force. Because he is incorporeal, none of the happenings which occur to the parts of the body can be attributed to him.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Maimonides says a bunch of things here, and he says that to understand this is the positive commandment which states, I am the Lord thy God. So Maimonides thinks he's saying, Maimonides takes himself to be outlining some kind of commandment here, something that people are required to know and understand. And in fact, the very first commandment, according to Maimonides, what are all Jews obligated to know and understand? According to this passage. And how are Jews, according to this passage, how are Jews supposed to come to know that God is eternal? What reason does Maimonides give in this passage for this conclusion that God is eternal?
Because the celestial spheres revolve eternally, only an eternal. It has to be a source of from somewhere, and that source is God. And if that's eternal,
Okay.
and God is eternal.
Okay, so the very first commandment, obligatory on all Jews, most important thing you have to do to be a Jew is not Shabbat, is not prayer, is not dietary laws, not circumcision for male children. The very first commandment, according to Maimonides, is to know enough about astronomy so that you know that God exists and is eternal and doesn't have a body. Right? This is what Maimonides says. This is just the basis of Jewish law. You need to know that there's this important scientific principle out there that the heavens are in constant motion, and you need to derive from that the conclusion that God exists and is eternal and incorporeal. Your first obligation as a Jew is to be a religiously minded scientist and philosopher. Seems to be what Maimonides is saying here. Now, in a moment, we'll think about what we think about this position and why someone might find it compelling and why might someone find it troubling. But let's continue. Jonas, I think there's another handout So Maimonides makes this claim, and then he realizes there's some kind of question or problem that's going to occur to some of his readers. And he outlines this in the next passage. Can I get a volunteer to read the next passage where it says, "Why were there illusions?" Thank you.
The writings of the Torah to under his feet, written with the finger of God, the hand of the Lord, the eyes of the Lord, the ears of the Lord, and such like. All of these expressions are related to the capacity of man who only understand material things, and the Torah spoke the language that man could understand.
Thank you so much. So Maimonides has made this claim. Your basic obligation as a Jew is to be a scientist and a philosopher and figure out that God exists and has no body. And then he imagines someone asking a question. Can you summarize that question in your own words? Yes. And that there's only one God, exactly right. There's one ultimate cause. So monotheism as a unique incorporeal God derived from science and philosophy is your basic obligation for Maimonides. And then he imagines that someone upon hearing this might have a question. And he outlines that question at the beginning here with this phrase, "Why were there?" Could someone summarize in their own words, what question does Maimonides imagine someone asking?
Well, because the Torah refers to different parts of the body, a hand, a finger, a ear, an eye, and he's saying, well, if the Torah says that, you got to believe that those exist.
Okay, Bible's chock full of language saying God has a body. Maimonides gives a few examples here. We know some of this from some traditional Jewish liturgy. God takes the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Kind of sounds like God has a body there. And in fact, these aren't even the most bodily images that Maimonides could have picked. In the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve hear God walking through the garden at the breezy time of day. It's hard to make sounds at the breezy time of day walking through a garden without a body. At one famous point in the book of Exodus, Moses says, "God, I'd like to see your face." And God says, "You can see my back, but not my face, and I'm going to shelter you in my hand." Again, it sounds like God at least has a face, hand, and a back there. It's not obvious, Maimonides says, that God doesn't have a body. And so his answer is that the way we make sense of this is that all these expressions are related to the capacity of men who only understand material things, and the Torah spoke in language that men could understand. How does Maimonides respond to this question of why is there so much body language in the Bible if God doesn't really have a body?
So we would understand because we are limited intellectually.
Hey, it's hard to picture and conceptualize and relate to a completely incorporeal God. When I'm trying to imagine God turning the spheres and moving all the, right? I look, even instinctually now, right? I imagine there being a hand that's doing it. When I'm sitting there trying to pray, it's hard to know how to pray to some incorporeal something. It's going to be much more powerful for me to think of that God as having a face with ears that can hear my cries and eyes that can see what's going on in the world and a hand that can turn the cosmos. We need this kind of language, but none of it's meant to be taken literally, Maimonides says. It's just a concession to the limitations of human beings. Don't read the Torah literally when it talks about God having a body. Okay, so this is how Maimonides begins his account of Jewish law. You need to know that God exists, is one and incorporeal, and you need to know that through science. And anything in the Torah that contradicts that, read it metaphorically. Don't read it literally. Okay, we're going to move on in a second to some other parts of Maimonides. Again, maybe we'll get to Spinoza, maybe not. Let me pause and ask, this is already a passage in Maimonides that some people have found profoundly inspiring and others have found deeply troubling. Why might someone find this kind of perspective compelling? Why might someone have concerns about, be troubled by the claims we've seen Maimonides make so far?
Well, if you could be troubled by it because you believe everything in the Torah is true, And therefore, if the Torah says something, that God has a finger or a hand or whatever, then you have to take it as true.
Okay. So one concern we might have on this, and absolutely Maimonides critics focused on this, is Maimonides, you claim that you're just reinterpreting the Bible here. Aren't you actually getting rid of the Bible here? Where in the Bible does it say, anytime I talk about God as having a hand, it's metaphorical? No, that's a conclusion you're making on your own, Maimonides. You're substituting your own human judgment, your own scientific judgment, derived from an ancient Greek philosopher named Aristotle, who was emphatically not Jewish, for the Torah. You are setting up human beings over the Torah here. That might be one kind of criticism, and one reason Maimonides was called a heretic. Can we imagine any other concerns someone might have about this claim that our first obligation is to know through science something about God and reinterpret everything in the Torah that contradicts it? Yes.
Maybe they'll think something different later on.
Okay, so now we've got two concerns. Not only are you setting human beings up over the Torah, you're setting science up over the Torah. First, we might have real concerns about what this means practically. Does this mean, excuse me, that Jewish education should begin not with reading the Torah and not with getting kind of basic kind of linguistic skills and textual skills, but with science? I mean, kind of seems to imply that. In fact, if you were going to then read chapters 2 through 4 of this section of the Mishneh Torah, it's a science textbook. Maimonides goes on and says, by the way, your next obligation, love and fear God. How do you love and fear God? By studying God's works, because then you're going to be filled with love and filled with awe. And now I'm going to describe God's works for you, and it reads like a really good summary of medieval science. And in fact, one explanation of why Maimonides wrote the Mishneh Torah, wrote his legal code, it's not entirely clear why he did it, but he talks at one point about how I don't want people to have to constantly go back to the Talmud, to rabbinic literature, to figure out what to do. I want to give them a concise account of what to do. And one way to understand that is he wanted the Jewish intellectual elite to have more time to study science and not waste their time as much on rabbinic literature. Not that he was opposed to rabbinic literature. He's setting up, isn't this a radical reimagining of the Jewish educational system where we're going to replace Aristotelian science with Torah? What about people who don't have access to science, right? Not everyone gets to go to a university and take science classes. Are they just doomed to be, at best, second-class Jews because they didn't get to know science? And what happens if science changes? Now, Maimonides does talk about that. He imagines sort of reinterpreting it, but what does that mean for something like the Mishneh Torah? Are we, very few of us believe in Aristotelian science today. Does that mean we're all bad Jews from Maimonides' perspective because we don't learn Aristotelian science, right? Maimonides here seems to be, on these accusations, setting up the human mind over the Torah and setting up science as the ultimate form of Jewish knowledge, perhaps in competition with others. These are some aspects of his thoughts that turned out to be seen as potentially heretical. In a moment, we're going to see it get even more heretical. Someone want to imagine a defense of Maimonides here, right? If we had Maimonides in front of us, would he just sort of say, you're right, I'm a heretic, I'm so sorry? How might Maimonides want to defend himself in the face of these charges of heresy? Yes?
You stated earlier that we should study the beautiful creations of Hashem. And I mean, just the way, as we increase our knowledge, of science, I can see that he would have thought, okay, let's accept this. And this is, we know from science that there's no body here. And let's move on from there.
Okay.
And go a little deeper from there. So I think that's what he was doing. I mean, it's just like interpreting God's work today.
Okay.
In terms of what we know that we didn't know 100 years ago.
Okay, so I've got a twofold potential defense that we can imagine Maimonides offering. One defense might be to say, how are you saying I'm setting up human wisdom over God This is an act of profound. God is accessible through the human mind. And I'm saying, in fact, that it all has to make sense, that Judaism has to make sense, and science has to make sense, not an act of heresy. And moreover, this is going to ensure the survival of Judaism because science is actually going to change over time. And Maimonides knew this. His famous book of philosophy, which we'll read a passage from in a moment, called The Guide of the Perplexed, he begins the perplexity by saying, well, the perplexity is I don't know what to do with science and Judaism. But then he has one passage where he says, actually, the true perplexity is that the science we have today is already showing some cracks in it. And I don't know what we're going to need to do about that. And maybe this is a position that's profoundly flexible, right? This is a position that says, look, take the best science of your assault upon Judaism. This is securing Jewish continuity. Okay, so far, maybe Maimonides is a heretic. Maybe he's a profound follower of Judaism. Let's see how he wants to continue the argument. Can I get a volunteer to read the next passage where it says, it has already been stated before? This is from Maimonides' philosophical treatise, The Guide of the Perplexed.
It has already been said before in this treatise that anything that entails corporeality ought of necessity be negated in reference to him, and that all affections, a technical term meaning emotions, likewise should be negated in reference to him. For all affections or emotions entail change, and moreover, the agent who affects those affections is undoubtedly not identical with him who is acted upon or affected. Accordingly, if he, may he be exalted, were subject to affection or emotion in any respect whatever, someone other than he would act upon him and effect change in him. Likewise, it should be negated that he sometimes lacks a certain perfection, while at other times it exists in him. For if this should be supposed, he would be only potentially perfect with reference to him, his being similar to any existing thing.
Thank you so much. Okay, there's a lot going on here. So Maimonides, we're going to figure it out. We're going to figure it out. So Maimonides says, we need to negate the idea that God has any effect, meaning something like emotions. So he's beginning by saying, we need to deny the idea that God has any emotions. We'll see it. Yes.
Yeah, it gets mad.
Okay. So we're going to get there in a moment, right? In the Bible, God feels all the things, right? Right. So we're going to get there in a moment. Let's see what Maimonides' argument is, but then let's see how he deals with that, right? So Maimonides is making actually what's already a pretty kind of bold statement here. He's saying, no emotions for God. And he'll make this even more explicit. Next passage, he'll says, God is neither angry nor laughs, does not rejoice or grieve. Okay, we're going to get back to some pushback in a second. Now we're really getting into heresy territory here, right? Now we're getting into one of maybe the 3 points in Maimonides' thought that were seen as most controversial. Let's see what his argument is for why we should deny that God has any emotions. One argument he gives is that if God, may he be exalted, were subject to emotion in any respect whatever, someone other than he would act upon him and effect change in him. What might Maimonides mean? First, what might he mean when he says that, well, if someone feels an emotion, that means that someone outside of them is acting on them and effecting a change in them. What might Maimonides mean there?
Well, if he were a jealous God, then he's got to be jealous of somebody and something, and therefore that would be another being or something.
Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. What does it mean to feel an emotion? Let's take jealousy as the example. Well, presumably the reason I feel jealous is that something happens, something outside of me does something that makes me jealous, right? I am not presuming most times I feel jealousy. I don't just spontaneously say, today's going to be a jealous day. No, something happens and it makes me jealous. Similarly, when I feel happy, generally, it's not enough for me to just wake up in the morning and say, today I want to feel happy. Generally, something outside of me happens and it makes me happy. That's even how our language works, right? What made you happy, we say. Similar to anger, right? Generally, something happens that makes you angry. Same with sadness. Something happens that makes you sad. Generally, emotion is a reactive kind of condition. Why might Maimonides think that it's a problem, therefore, think that God has emotions? Why might Maimonides think that it's a problem making God feel something?
Nothing's gonna make an end whether you're sad or affect him.
Okay, you're saying that something outside of God has power over God there, right? You're right. Again, think about it from a kind of human experience, right? Something outside of me makes me angry. It has a kind of power over me. It changes me. Do we really want to say that things outside of God change God and have a power over God? That's what you're saying, Maimonides says, when you say that God has an emotion. When you say that God feels anger or happiness, you're saying that something outside of God, however momentarily, has power over God. You're saying that God is not all powerful at that moment, that something else is in charge of God. You are insulting God and blaspheming God, Maimonides would say, when you say that God has an emotion, because you're denying divine omnipotence at that point. Yes, hand here, and then hand there.
Yeah, even if you have full knowledge of the past, present, future, he's given free will, so it's still be angry.
Okay, so let's come back to that let's hold off on that for a moment. Let's get Maimonides' full argument, and then we're going to have plenty of time to push back on Maimonides here. And we're going to have to ask also about creation in this context. We talked about Maimonides giving beings free will. We're going to have to think about what kind of creation this Maimonidean God would engage in here. So we're going to have plenty of time to push back on Maimonides. Let's get the full argument on the table, and then absolutely we're going to, we can ourselves determine that Maimonides is heretical here. I think I saw a hand back there as well.
Yes, just a reminder, you're already
Yes.
doing it, but people in the on Zoom cannot hear us, so repeat somewhat the questions or the answer that we give, so they know what.
Of course. Thank you. Okay, so reason one, and Maimonides is going to have two more reasons why we can't think that God has emotions. Reason one is that you're denying divine omnipotence when you say that God has emotions. Second reason Maimonides says is that all emotions entail change. What might Maimonides mean there? Why might he think that having an emotion involves change? And why might it be problematic to say that God experiences change? First, why might having an emotion involve change?
God is eternal. So he didn't say, he doesn't think that God can change. That's eternal. He must be the way he is, and just stay that way.
Okay, so let's think about this for a moment. First, why? So there's some concern we're going to have here about God changing, about why God would ever change. Let's think about this. Why might Maimonides think that emotion is a kind of condition that involves change?
We get changed by emotions.
Okay, so let's think about it. Generally, emotion is something that happens in response to something. Angry, something happens, and then I feel angry. Maybe eventually it fades, but emotion seems to involve some kind of change there, from not feeling something to feeling something. Same with sadness. Generally, we think of sadness as a condition that involves kind of not feeling sadness, and then something happens that makes me sad, and then I'm sad, and maybe it fades over time. It involves me changing. Same with happiness, we might say. Same with falling in love, we might say, right? Presumably, I don't already love my spouse when I'm born. Although I actually did turn out to meet my spouse when I was 3, although then her family moved away and didn't reconnect to college. I might not be the best example here. But in general, right, falling in some kind of encounter happens, and love develops in whatever weird way love develops, and then it either continues or it fades over time. But love, right? Emotions involve change. And Maimonides' point, as you were saying, is, do you really want to say that God changes over time? Why would God change over time? God is presumably perfect. God is presumably the best God could be. And so any change would be for the worse. Right? If you're already perfect, why would you change? You're already as good as you can be. The only kinds of things that would change are imperfect beings, beings that have the potential to be better. So are you really saying that God is imperfect? Are you really saying that God is not already the best that God could be? Of course we don't want to say that, Maimonides says. Of course we don't want to say that God is imperfect. And so, you know what? We can't say God has emotions. Just as emotions involve someone outside of you acting on you, we don't want to say that God is under the authority of others. Emotions also involve change, and surely we don't want to say that the perfect eternal God is changeable. And finally, Maimonides will say there's one other reason why we should deny that God has emotion. One must likewise of necessity deny, with reference to him, his being similar to any existing thing. What might Maimonides mean there? What might Maimonides mean? Why might he think that saying God has emotion is saying that God is similar to something that exists? And why might it be a problem to say that God is similar to something that exists? Okay, right. So emotions, when you say God has emotion, you're comparing God to, for example, yourself and other human beings, right? Most of us have emotions. And so when you say God has emotions, you're saying God is like us. That's pretty insulting to God. I mean, you're all wonderful, I'm sure. I'm pretty imperfect. For me to compare myself to God, that's insulting to God. It's almost sort of setting me up as an image of God. And we have a term in the history of Judaism for setting up things in the image of God and calling them God. We call that idolatry. And so Maimonides' point here seems to be, if we really think about God, if we really think hard, we come to the conclusion that it is insulting to God, blasphemous to God, to say that God has emotions. Because even if you don't mean to be saying that, your God is imperfect and changeable, and that God is just like you. So just to make sure we get the point very clear here, would Maimonides say that the statement God is happy is literally true? God is sad? To those online, people are shaking their head. Well, but would Maimonides say, just based on this passage, that God is ever actually angry? Well, right, so we're going to get to pushback, but from Maimonides' perspective, would it be correct to say that God is angry? No. From Maimonides' perspective, would it be correct to say that God feels love? No. The Maimonidean God feels nothing. The Maimonidean God is an unchangeable being, spending all of eternity incorporeally turning the cosmos around, sphere after sphere after sphere. Okay. People, for those of you watching online, or listening online, there were already a bunch of kind of hands that were shooting up. So why might someone have been troubled by this Maimonidean vision of God? Why are you troubled by this Maimonidean vision of God? And then we'll get some defenses. Yeah, I think we have hand here, hand there. We had some concerns there as well. Yes?
Some references in Torah of God being angry and taking actions and regretting and loving and some and not others. So there's a lot of references to it right there in our basic scripture.
Okay, so one kind of concern, and we heard this with the claim that God does get angry earlier, is first of all, if we thought that Maimonides was setting himself up over the literal meaning of the Bible when it came to God having a body, we did not know what we were in for, right? Because however many references there are to God having a body in the Bible, there are a lot more to God feeling things. God loves the Israelites in the Bible. He sets his heart on them. He favors them. God seems to love Abraham, for example. That seems to be connected to this whole loving the Israelite thing. God gets angry at lots of things in the Bible. God gets angry at, well, basically everyone in the Bible at some point. The Israelites, and all right, God, no one is spared God's anger. God has regrets in the Bible when after God creates humanity, by the time we get to the generation of Noah and the flood, God kind of says basically, oh my God, I regret that I created them. Maimonides seems to be challenging kind of almost every central narrative in the Bible and saying that these are not literally true. And in fact, he says that explicitly in the next passage on your handout, just so that we encounter that. Can I get a volunteer to read the next passage on the handout? This is going back to that first text, the Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law. So his account of law that he thinks every Jew should follow. Can I get a volunteer to read where it says there is no death or life in God? Thank you.
There is no death or life in God as in living bodies, no folly or wisdom such as are found in man. He neither sleeps nor wakens, is neither angry nor laughs, does not rejoice or grieve, has no silence or speech like the speech of man. Because of this, all descriptions of the Holy One in the Torah and those uttered by the prophets are merely metaphorical and figurative.
I'm going to pause right there just for the sake of time. Maimonides says this out loud in his code of Jewish law for everyone. You know what? I know the Bible talks a lot about God having emotions. It's all metaphor. It's all just an attempt to allow us to relate to God, to have something in our minds when we picture God turning the cosmos, something in our minds when we pray. Later on, he talks about the political lessons that we derive from this. Thinking about God as feeling anger is a politically important idea because it's going to discourage wrongdoing and inspire you to take action against injustice. But none of it is meant literally to be true. Anytime the Bible talks about God loving, all of those beautiful narratives, about God loving the Israelites, God loving Abraham, God getting angry at injustice, it's all metaphorical. So this might be one reason someone is troubled by this. It seems to reduce key aspects of the Bible, or not reduce, but at least treat them as metaphors. And doesn't seem to, it does that. Okay, you also had some kind of concern about Maimonides. Okay, so not only, we might say, are there kind of heretical interpretive consequences for this, we might say there are heretical practical consequences from this position. So first we might wonder if there's no God watching us out there, whose anger we can incur if we behave poorly, and whose rewards we can earn if we behave righteously, why are we going to ever behave righteously? I'm just going to, let me eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die, to quote another classic phrase, right? There's no God watching us. So maybe this is not just threatening the literal meaning of the Torah. Maybe this is actually threatening basic morality. Let's think about this more for a moment. Can we imagine any other practical consequences? Of course, that might follow from this. Any other actions associated with Judaism traditionally, for example, or ideas associated with Judaism that might not make as much sense if God doesn't feel anything or care about us or ever kind of is ever affected by us? Yes?
God becomes very impersonal.
Okay, so God becomes very impersonal also, utterly distant from us. Would this kind of God ever reveal a Torah to us, do we think?
No.
Why not? Why might this God who never changes and doesn't feel anything, why might we be worried why might we think that God wouldn't reveal a Torah to us?
Detachment.
Okay, so presumably for God to reveal the Torah, God's got to have some modicum of care for us, right? God's got to think somehow the world will be better if God reveals the Torah to us. But if God doesn't care, why is God ever going to take God's time to decide to reveal the Torah? Over revealing the Torah sounds like something that involves change, right? First, God hasn't revealed the Torah, then God reveals the Torah, and then God presumably is done revealing the Torah. That sounds a lot like a God who changes. This Maimonidean account of God having no emotions seems to undermine any kind of personal God, any kind of literal meaning of many parts of the Bible, basic morality, and the very idea that the Torah even comes from God. And Maimonides never says that out loud, but he comes pretty close to saying that. According to Maimonides, the Torah is a text produced by a prophet named Moses. Prophets are people who have perfect intellects. For Maimonides, he gets this from medieval Islamic philosophy. Prophets are people with perfect intellects, so they know everything that a human being could know, and they have perfect imaginations. So they can present those truths in vivid, powerful language. Maimonides doesn't quite say it, but the entire thrust of his philosophy is that the Torah was not spoken by God, but rather was created by this amazing prophetic figure named Moses, who knew all there was to know and could present it in vivid, powerful language. So Maimonides seems to undermine literal meaning of the Bible, many aspects, kind of morality, and the Torah itself. Let's take one other idea. Do we think this God would choose the Jewish people? A God who feels nothing and can never change? Does it seem like that kind of God would choose any particular people? Why would he? Choosing sounds like, again, you got to care enough about that people or the world to engage in an active choice. And again, choosing kind of sounds like a process that involves change. I haven't chosen the Jewish people. Then Abraham shows up and I enter into a covenant with Abraham. And then Abraham has these descendants and they wander through the desert and I kind of enter into a relationship, right? That sounds like a lot of change. Sounds like it's got to involve some kind of care. It's not clear that this is something a Maimonidean God could do at all. This is one of the main reasons why Maimonides was seen as a heretic. Not only does he seem to say, to be a good Jew, you need to be a scientist and philosopher. Not only does he need to say all that stuff, does he say all that stuff in the Bible about God having a body is not literally true. He also seems to be saying that this basic idea of a personal God who feels and can change is actually insulting to God. And all of these key ideas traditionally associated with the Jewish tradition seem to fall to the wayside. This wasn't the only reason Maimonides was seen as heretical. Yes, 5 minutes, perfect. But this was one of the reasons he was seen as heretical. And so we've got 5 minutes left, so I want to sort of open it up to more questions, both to sort of potential defenses of Maimonides. Does anyone want to offer a defense of why, again, how Maimonides would respond, but also other kinds of questions, both from in person and from online? Yes.
My basic question at this point is, if this is Rambam Maimonides' perspective and basic viewpoint, he has become an essential sage used throughout Judaism today. It's very strange to me.
Yeah. So the part of the question here is, if Maimonides is as heretical as I have made him out to be, should BMH just take him out of the library right now? You don't need to answer that question. So there are a couple of answers to that question. One is that Maimonides, for all that he holds all these views, and for all that he really does, and I think this is just the right way to interpret Maimonides, think that the Torah does not come directly from God, he very much thinks that Jewish law is binding. Not because it comes from God, but because it is the ideal law for a community. Maimonides says you can have two kinds of legal systems out there. You can have a legal system that just addresses social order, so it stops people from killing one another, stops people from stealing. But you can also have a more elevated kind of legal system, a legal system that also promotes the perfection of human beings, promotes intellectual perfection, and that's what Jewish law is. Jewish law is a legal system that, for example, requires you to become a scientist and philosopher. Jewish law is a legal system that creates enough harmony that people can have time and space to pursue all of this knowledge. So one reason that Maimonides becomes this kind of venerated figure is that while his theological views are quite heterodox, he is a crucial figure in the history of Jewish law. He writes the first comprehensive code of Jewish law. It sparks the whole project of the codification of Jewish law, which continues to this day. We would never have had texts like the Shulchan Aruch, a great later medieval code of Jewish law, or any of the codes of Jewish law we have today. That's one reason. A second reason is that he wrote really carefully. And so this passage about God not having emotions, denying affections, that's written in the Guide of the Perplexed, not the Mishnah Torah. The Guide of the Perplexed was written in what's called Judeo-Arabic, which is a kind of fusion of Hebrew and Arabic that was deliberately written to only be accessible to the intellectual elite. So many people just didn't quite realize how radical his views are. And some people have found him inspiring, separable from the specific content of his claims. So for example, one could disagree with Aristotelian science. One could even disagree with his claim about God and emotions and still be inspired by the idea that we should reconcile science and Judaism. Right? For example, someone might say, as many Jews did, I actually think that it's entirely plausible for God to have emotions. A perfect human being would not be an unchangeable human being who never had emotions. That's not a perfect being, that's a sociopath. And so maybe actually a perfect God would also have emotions. And you could have that view but still be inspired by Maimonides. So some people might say actually he was a heretic, but a pretty damn inspiring one, is another kind of response. Other kind of responses to Maimonides here.
There's one question.
There's one question. Okay. How does God's quality of omniscience play into... Okay, so we have a question online. How does God's quality of omniscience play into Maimonides' concerns about change, right? So the question here is, what does this unchangeable God know about the world? Surely if God actually knows what's going on in the world, how can God not have emotions, right? How can you look at the world, how can you look at the world around us today and not have some kind of reaction, right? This is not a world designed to inspire indifference. So this is a complicated question for Maimonides. Part of it is he thinks that God is fundamentally unlike us. Another part of it is it's not clear that the Maimonidean God knows what medieval philosophers called particulars. So we can imagine two different categories of knowledge. One category of knowledge might be this guy standing at the front of the room right now, his name is Eli, he is 44 years old. That's a knowledge of a particular about me. Another kind of knowledge might be there are such things as human beings, there are such things as stars, and the stars move spherically. Maimonides seems to think that while it's clear that God knows the latter, those generalities, it's not clear that God knows the former. Because again, particulars change, right? I exist right now, but I'm not going to be in this room in a few minutes. And I'm not going to be in this room tomorrow. That means the statement, 44-year-old Eli Sacks is standing in this room, is only true now and is not going to be true shortly. So if God thought that thought, if God thought Eli Sacks is standing in front of this room, God is going to then have to think something else soon. And that means that God is going to change. Whereas it's always true that there is a species called human beings, and it's always true that the stars moved eternally. So one way this plays into this is the Maimonidean God maybe doesn't know our individual features. Maybe the Maimonidean God only knows generalities. This is a kind of major debate in Maimonides scholarship. We've come to the end of our time together, so I just want to offer 3 questions that I think have arisen from this conversation. There's a question about the limits of belief, there's a question about the possibilities of belief, and there's a question about how we decide. So first, there's a question about the limits of belief. You shouldn't believe. Is that true? Are there limits to what kind of beliefs Judaism can support? Are there limits to what kind of belief being a citizen of a particular country can support? Are there limits to what kinds of beliefs being a human being should support? Are there limits to belief, or is belief something that's always open to contestation? So I think one question here. Another question is about the possibilities of belief. Maimonides doesn't just think that there are limits on belief. He also thinks there are some things that you should believe, and some things that certain forms of knowledge make possible. Knowing science leads you to experience the world differently. Thinking about God leads you to think of the world differently. And the question that arises here is sort of, what are the possibilities of belief? How do we come to know things? And how does our life change once we start to believe certain things? What difference does belief make? And the final one is a question about how we decide these things. Maimonides, whether one likes him or dislikes him, has no problem setting himself up as an arbiter who makes these kinds of decisions. Who gets to decide what's an acceptable belief? How do we decide what counts as an acceptable belief? What questions should we be asking? And when we disagree with what others think about what counts as an acceptable belief, what do we do about it? I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I'm really grateful to you for taking the time to think about them today. I wish you a wonderful afternoon. To those of you here in Denver, enjoy the beautiful weather. To those of you online, I hope the weather is beautiful where you are as well. Thank you again to the Valley Beit Midrash and to BMHBJ for the opportunity to think and learn. And thank you to all of you for kind of taking the intellectual risk to wrestle with these questions. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you to all of you.